Hi, everybody. As you know, we published a book called What the Nurses Saw, and it ended up being nearly 500 pages. And there were a whole lot more nurses we could have spoken with if we could have done the encyclopedia of this subject. And what we're doing now is getting to speak with some of the nurses that aren't in the book. If you think the book was eye-opening, these after book interviews are going to blow your mind even more. They're blowing my mind. uh, Two things I'm learning a lot. It's funny, you write a book and you think you know something, and then once the book is out, people that know a lot more knock on your door and say, "Did you know about this? Did you know about that?" So I'm getting that from some great nurses. As people also know, I'm also learning about the surviving family members, and that's becoming a huge issue as well. Our guest today is Gail McCrae. Welcome, Gail.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for spending the time on this. So, Gail, if you could just give us a quick thumbnail, how long you've been a nurse, what your specialty was, where you used to live, because like so many people, they've had to move. What attracted you to nursing in the first place? I always like to ask that.
Well, I was the daughter of a nurse, and then
Oh, okay.
my grandmother was a certified nurse midwife, one of the very first, as a matter of fact.
Wow.
So it kind of runs in my blood. My brother is an herbalist, so a different kind of medical practitioner. The whole family were very much into wellness, either through food or through treatment of conditions through plant medicine. And I integrated in the standard Western education into the family, as did my mom. So yeah, it was kind of a natural progression. I went to school in California. I'm from the North Bay area, Sonoma County. I went to the junior college there, and then I got my bachelor's degree from Cal State East Bay, which is in the Bay Area, just south of Oakland. I graduated in 2011 with a BSN and immediately went into acute care. So I spent my whole career working as an acute care nurse. Originally, I was hired into ICU and telemetry. I worked on an open heart ICU, and then progressed into telemetry and med surge. I knew in college that I wanted to become a certified nurse midwife. I saw what was going on in the labor and delivery wards in the hospitals. And it concerned me that, in combination with the data, a lot of people don't know this, but the United States has one of the highest mortality rates for women, for birthing mothers. In the country, it's actually safer for a woman to give birth in Yemen than it is here in the United States. We have such a high death rate in our laboring women. And so I felt that there was a lot of room there for improvement. And I always tend to go towards those areas where advocacy can be applied. I've always been an advocate. I've always had a very strong sense of right and wrong, and I've always been a very courageous person. Another part of my story is that you'll like this. I lived and worked in rural Africa as a nurse for a year. About 2.5 years into my profession, I picked up and went to Africa with my husband and worked in a hospital there for about a year delivering babies, which was a profound experience. We went independently, so again, the courage and uh, the very vibrant, wishes to experience life are strong within me.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And when you're which country was it?
Zambia for most of the time. I also worked in some clinics in Zimbabwe.
And so when you're in countries like that, they
Sorry.
don't have all the fancy stuff that we have. And so those who are capable are invited to do what needs to be done. It's not as hierarchical and rigid as it is in the United States. And so you probably got a lot of experience that you might not have had in the US.
Definitely. Sorry, I actually spent most of my time in Tanzania and then some in Zambia and Zimbabwe.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Beautiful places.
Absolutely. Yeah, we worked in the Serengeti district of Tanzania. So I did get experience with the safaris. It was fun. But you're absolutely right. I had some very profound experiences there in management of surgery and just so I'll say one thing in the population of women that I was managing care for, basically 100% of the women had had their clitorises cut at the age of 13. So there was a lot of atrocities and things that I was facing on a daily basis that had to do with, mostly it's just women there are slaves. They're bought and sold by their fathers to their husbands when they start their menstrual cycles, and they just spend their whole lives having children and taking care of the farm. So it was, what it did for me more than anything was that it really helped me understand uh what to be afraid of and what not to be afraid of in life.
Hmm.
When you're put into an environment like that, I would say that it was one of the reasons why I was so resilient against the propaganda
Hmm.
of COVID,
Hmm.
because I had spent a year living and working in a community where I was really engaging with people at such a raw life and death experience that it changed, it changed my views and ideas of wellness, of medical care, and of how to engage with people ethically and truthfully when it comes to just just existing as human beings on this planet.
Sure. It's interesting. Of course, Nicole worked in field hospital in Syria. Aaron Marie
Mhm.
was in a live combat zone. So yeah, so this is a thread that runs through the lives of many of the nurses that stood up. You had something in your life that taught you the difference between what's really worth fighting for, and because you're all fighters. I mean, not in the aggressive sense, but you're all fighters for what's right. So you spent that time in Africa, amazing, and then you came back to the U.S. Did you then change to being a midwife after the after the surgical nursing that you did?
Well, I came back pregnant and I had a couple kids back to back. Um, so that kind of encompassed my life for about 4 years. And I went back to working hospital medicine. So that's when I was hired by Kaiser Permanente, actually. So in 2015, when I was pregnant with my son, I was hired by Kaiser and I worked for them through both of my pregnancies and births. And then I started grad school when my daughter was about 2 years old.
Gotcha. And for people that don't know, because I used to live in San Francisco, I was there for about 8 years. Kaiser Permanente is the 800-pound, maybe 8,000-pound gorilla is it just North California or is it the whole state?
It's the whole state. It was founded in Northern California, so we have the most robust medical care facilities in Northern California. But I think they actually service the whole western part of the country. There's Kaisers in many other states as well.
Yeah, and that's something we may end up talking about later or not. And this came up on an interview. I casually said, well, when you're dealing with these hospital corporations, and the interviewer said, oh, that's really interesting. I've never heard a hospital referred to as a hospital corporation. And I said, listen, you have to understand, these aren't, the hospitals of 60 or 80 or 100 years ago. These are corporate entities. And they have a very different mentality than the original hospitals, I think. I have to do a deep dive into the history of the development of hospitals in the U.S., but clearly they've transferred from true nonprofit organizations to corporate behemoths. And that's
Yeah.
part of, I think, what we're dealing with. We're going to talk about COVID on this call, but in the pre-call, we were talking about something really important, that an experience you had in graduate school that first revealed something very important that everybody should know about, but two, also mentally prepared you for confronting the COVID situation. So you went to grad school. And were you going for what degree were you going for?
So my master's, it was a double nurse practitioner degree in women's health and as a certified nurse midwife. So I would be able to be a primary care provider and give full scope of care to women of any age and then babies in the male range and then in the adult range. So there's a pediatric population that I don't have um, um, the ability to provide care for, but yes, it was a double master's, and I started it during COVID. I applied before COVID, and then I started the program in 2020, and it was a wonderful program. It was an online program, which gave me a lot of flexibility. So I transitioned my work schedule back so into a per diem position. So I was primarily focusing on my graduate degree. So I do 8 weeks, 9 weeks of education, and then I'd go per diem. I'd go to the hospital and I work for 3 weeks straight during my break. And so that class I took, I took a medical research class, and then I also took another class that was more on the psychosocial aspects of midwifery. And one of the assignments was to do a 15-minute PowerPoint presentation on a controversial topic in the field of midwifery. And me being the the very intense, very always looking to get down to the bottom of everything that I encounter, I chose out of hospital births because it's very controversial and it's kind of a taboo subject. A lot of OBGYNs, they'll sit there and they'll say, "Oh, it's unsafe. People should not have out of hospital births." But then a lot of
So just to be clear, so out of hospital is you don't have the baby in the hospital, you have it at home or in a facility that's designed to be uh, to be friendly and nice and warm and well organized as opposed to the hospital setting. So out of hospital.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you. Yeah, and so I reviewed the data on those parameters on, who says what is safe and what is unsafe and why. And I discovered that ACOG, the AMA, and the WHO all put on medical recommendations to their practitioners that out-of-hospital births were unsafe and that women should only have babies in a hospital. And they stated the reason for that was because there was a higher risk for post-birth seizures of the infant. And then I went to ACOG, which is it's the largest, most respected research organization in the world. They only offer medical recommendations on a topic when they have all tiers of research fulfilled. So there's a triangle of research. It has cohort studies, meta-analysis, double-blind studies. And in that pyramid, Cochrane will only put out a recommendation if they have a robust quantity of data from all of those tiers of evidence. So they did put out a recommendation and they showed better outcomes with out of hospital births. And so I was perplexed to as why these major organizations around the world were not indicating the same
It
recommendations.
sounds like they were actively discouraging out of hospital births, claiming it was dangerous. And then this other
Yes.
group, which is the sort of the gold standard of medical research, said, no, safer.
Yeah, and so I decided to more deeply delve into the medical three-letter organizations to find out why they were saying out of hospital births were not safe. So I went down to the bottom of the ACOG medical recommendations. So this is the website that every OBGYN in the country has to follow. The medical recommendations that ACOG puts forward, if an OBGYN goes against medical recommendations, they are putting their license at risk.
And do you
And
know
this
what
is
ACOG stands for? The
American
American College?
American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology.
Gotcha. So if you're in
ACOG.
that profession, they set the rules. And
Correct.
if you deviate from them in any way, you're on the road to losing your license.
Correct. So I went down to the bottom of that statement that said that it's not safe to have babies outside of a hospital, and there were 48 peer-reviewed studies cited. I read every single one. And then when I read them and I couldn't believe what I found, I went back and read them again. So what I found was that in those 48 studies, 46 showed better outcomes with out of hospital births. Lower NICU admissions, lower post-birth seizures, lower maternal hemorrhaging, lower infections of both mother and baby, better outcomes in all categories. 46 out of 48 of those studies. The two studies that didn't corroborate with the statement, or that did corroborate the statement. One of them was a study from 1995 based on a population of women who had unplanned out of hospital births. So they had no prenatal care, and they were not being monitored during their pregnancies. They didn't have a birth plan, and it was an emergency type of birth. So that population of women is not applicable to the study group. And the last study was authored by the same doctor who wrote the protocol on ACOG. And there was a letter to the editor stating that the evidence within the paper was inaccurate. And so what that means is that the professionals in that field of obstetrics and gynecology found errors in the paper and
Mm,
asked that the paper be pulled down from publication. So it
wow.
was pretty profound discovery. What I basically, the walk away was, is that these three-letter organizations are making medical recommendations and statements that don't have research to support them. So the practitioners, and in addition to that, the practitioners are being forced to follow those. So it helped me really go into COVID with a critical eye of
Mm.
what those three-letter organizations were saying: CDC, AMA, WHO. Like I automatically went into the pandemic just feeling like, well, I need to question these organizations because I've already discovered that they can't be trusted.
Wow, unbelievable. So you had already been a midwife and you practice in the field quite a bit. And because you had the opportunity to take some time to go into graduate studies as opposed to, working, practical work, you could start really digging into the literature and you got, training in how to read scientific papers and how to evaluate them. And so in your field, this most important thing, right? I mean, in some ways, all of human life depends on us getting this right, right? The birth process. The three-letter agencies, and I love that you refer to them that way. Um, I would call them four-letter words, but they're three-letter agencies, in fact. And this is hopefully a show for everybody. Um, they're saying, oh, it's so dangerous to have a baby outside of our wonderful hospital system. Don't do it. And then they're passing that down to all the doctors. And I imagine the midwives too. I imagine if a midwife disputes their pronouncement, he or she could get, well, I guess midwives are usually women, she could get in a bit of trouble too. And then you found out that the so-called science that these people were making this statement was completely backwards. You said 46 out of the 48 studies that they cited in their own judgment were saying that out of hospital safer, out of hospital when things are done well, the prenatal care, someone to be there with the mom when she's giving birth. And the only paper they could show, one of the paper was so bad, the profession wanted it pulled. And the other paper was looking at women that had the unfortunate experience of no prenatal care, no planned, birth. The birth just sort of happens in the back of a car, or God knows where, on a train, on a plane. I
Exactly.
mean, who knows? I mean, just the worst possible circumstance, which of course, is not going to have statistically the best outcome. So you learned right away that something was really rotten in the way our system works. And as you were describing what you discovered about birth and what's safe and what's not safe, it sounded exactly like COVID. You had a bunch of people uh, not following science, not following observable medical outcomes, declaring this stuff, ramming it down the throats of practitioners with an iron fist. I mean, losing your job and losing your license, that's sort of an iron fist punishment.
That's
Um,
correct.
it's so odd, right? They were always their mantra, which they've had to stop, was follow the science. We're following the science. And I'm not a super science guy, but I did study neuroscience when I was an undergrad, so I'm not terrorized by science. I know it's just like any other thing. You got to crack the book and figure it out. And I would hear all these liberal arts graduates who had never been clinicians in their lives telling me to follow the science. And I'm like, you graduated with a degree in English literature. You've never put a Band-Aid on anybody. What science are you following? You know what I mean? It just was, it was madness. But they can't use that anymore because I think so many people have woken up that they weren't following the science either. So this is such important material for everybody to know about because you said something I believe in our pre-roll while we were just talking, and I think you need to tell this. It's dangerous to have a baby in the United States in a hospital. Like statistically, compared to other countries, uh, we're the worst. And if you took at developed countries, we're the worst. And when we say dangerous, we mean babies dying. We mean mothers dying, like dying, not just
Yeah.
being difficult, death,
Yes.
preventable death,
That's
uh,
correct. We
right?
have the highest maternal death rate in the developed world here in the United States. It is more safe as a woman to give birth in Yemen than it is in the United States, along with a slew of other less developed countries. Uh, our fetal birth rates are comparable to the rest of the world, but it's really the women, the mothers are dying in this country
Oh,
at a higher
really?
rate
Okay.
than anywhere else in the world. And uh, the midwives, especially, have really tried to delve into why that's happening because the OB community really has not. And it's been difficult, but what we've kind of determined is that there does seem to be a correlation between increased rates of interventions and maternal deaths. So the more medications the woman takes, the more likely she is to end up getting a C-section, and C-sections are also correlated with higher death rates because of postpartum hemorrhaging. There's a huge risk for postpartum hemorrhage. So it's a very sad situation. But again, it's like you said, it really prepared me to kind of understand the way these organizations work and how they aren't necessarily following the evidence. And it's very clear. It's very clear when you really take that into account. I mean, we have the highest maternal death rate in the world. Clearly there's something very wrong with the way that we are practicing women's health. And the organizations won't stop and look at why. It's the same thing happening with autism and
Mhm.
autoimmune conditions. It's like we've gone from, one in thousands to one in 30 something children born with autism in the last 20 years. And no one will stop and try to discover why this is happening. So the same thing happens in women's health, and I would argue all the way across the board when it comes to healthcare. It's almost like, and this is kind of what I've come to over my years in this field, is that unless there's a financial incentive to study something, they won't. And the incentive here for them is that, the more people with chronic illness and disease, they are more likely to become long-term customers of the pharmaceutical industry. And that's the sad truth of what I have really come to learn after my graduate studies, is that all chronic illness and disease comes back to toxicity and deficiency
Mhm.
the human body. So we're poisoning ourselves with pesticides, chemicals on our food, medications, and we aren't able to access a high enough level of nutrition because of the depletion of our soils to actually create wellness in our lives.
Yeah.
It's
And
a
then
sad thing.
so much stuff that's put on the food shelves in supermarkets isn't even food. Like,
Correct.
just I hate to go on a tangent, but this is so like if you look at all the chips and stuff that people buy, potato chips, and you'll often see this thing called cottonseed oil. Well, cotton's an industrial plant. It has nothing to do with food at all. In the 19th century, only the lowest down skeezy farmer would feed his livestock cottonseed cake because it was a way to save a buck. And then now in the 20th century, now the 21st century, it's in everything. Our ancestors wouldn't have dreamed of eating cottonseed oil. And you just multiply that by a thousand different items in the food store. So, and yet nothing is said about that. And I imagine it's more lucrative to hospitals, obviously, to have the hospital in birth than it is to have it in a birth center or at home, right?
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
about
So
30 grand to have a baby in the hospital, and you can do an out of hospital birth for less than $6,000 in most places of the country.
30 grand.
Hmm.
You know, what does that do? I mean, how does a young, we wonder why our population isn't growing, why people aren't having kids the way they used to. Who could afford that? Who can take a $30,000 hit for every child you have? Unbelievable. Um, so you also, there's so much we could talk about, and before the call we figured out, okay, what three things can we talk about? Because really we could be on for a long time. But I think we just revealed something really important, a dark secret of American life, which is we can't stop saying this enough. We have the lowest survival rate for women in childbirth of any country in the world, or just any
Correct. Any developed country.
any
So
developed country.
I believe we're at right around 30th in the world. So all of the first world countries that are above us and most of the second world countries
Wow. So,
have better outcomes.
so that's really important for us to know. And if somebody's been told by the establishment that anything other than a hospital birth is automatically dangerous, now you know to check that and look into the options. Wow. Okay. So, I mean, that's an upsetting statistic for anybody that cares.